All right, hello everyone. Excuse me. And welcome to my channel. We do educational videos over here, and we try to do deep dives into some great theories of everything that you probably haven't heard of. All-encompassing theories, cosmologies, grand unified theories, magnum opuses and tour de forces, earth-shattering discoveries, stuff that some crackpot spent their whole life working on and was never recognized, always called a crackpot, always on the fringes. But I dug into their work and found out that they actually hit a home run with what they did. And so I'm trying to spread that out. Now, this is a history of what we're looking at today. And this is day 13 of this history called the Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And so this is a history, so this is not the cosmology itself, but the cosmology would be just the overall biblical and extra biblical corpus. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in Qumran, 20 miles from Jerusalem, and they are a lot of them are ancient documents from the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, 1st century AD, approximately. And there's a lot of copies of Old Testament books that are very, very similar to the ones that are in the canon. But then there's a lot of sectarian material as well. And so this is probably one of the 3 greatest archaeological discoveries of this time period. And the deception part in the title has to do with these mostly Catholic priests who are part of what is called the International Team, the research group that is taken the responsibility of translating these documents from the original Hebrew or Aramaic into Western modern languages and getting it out there to scholars. And lo and behold, they started translating some of the material and recognized that it didn't say what they wanted it to say. So they just started sitting on it and releasing just a bone, giving all the scholars a bone once every 3 years of some kind of relatively irrelevant part of the scrolls. And lo and behold, 40 years later, most of the scrolls are still not in the hands of the majority of scholars out there, and are being hoarded by this small group of mostly Christian, mostly Catholic priests. So this guy, Bajent, I'm not sure, Bajent, he is one of the authors of the book, and he's talking about his, he went over to Israel in 1989. This book is from 1991. And he met with a few people to try to figure out how we could, expedite this process. Now, he's with the Israelis, and they are not necessarily the culprits here. It's really these Catholic priests, but the Israelis have some pull. They have expressed a little bit of interest in getting this done a little bit quicker, and they have a much better track record than the international team. So he just had a pretty bad meeting with this woman, Sussman, over there, who just she basically said, the scrolls after all are not our job. Why is it causing trouble? She asked almost plaintively. We have other more important things to do. So Israel is, these scrolls were discovered just 1 year before Israel declared its independence, and so or declared themselves a country. And so the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls goes right along with that. And Israel, needless to say, is a little bit preoccupied to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of these, even though they are of extreme importance to both Jews and Christians. And the Jews, because these are all Old Testament texts, and give a great account of Old Testament Jews who were living in this monastery there. And then for Christians, because these documents appear to use a lot of jargon, a lot of kind of secret language that actually also turns up in the Gospels. So it's kind of like whoever wrote this also was certainly in communication with whoever wrote the Gospels. Okay, so we'll start up here. Bajent, needless to say, left the meeting disquieted. It is accepted wisdom in Israel that if one wishes to bury a subject, one creates a committee to study it, and so on. So the following day, Bajent met with Professor Shemariyahu Talman, one of two scholars at Hebrew University who were also members of the Oversight Committee. Professor Talman proved to be congenial company, indeed, wry, witty, well-traveled, sophisticated. Unlike Mrs. Sussman, moreover, he seemed to have not only an overview of the problem, but a familiarity with its minutiae and details, and a manifest sympathy for independent scholars seeking access to the Qumran material. Indeed, he said, he had had difficulties himself in the past, had been unable to obtain access to original texts, had been obliged to work with transcriptions and secondary sources, whose accuracy in some instances had subsequently proved to be questionable. Quote, controversy is the lifeblood of scholarship, Professor Talman declared at the very beginning of Bajent's meeting with him. He made it clear that he regarded his membership on the Oversight Committee as a welcome opportunity to help change the situation. If it is only a watchdog committee, he said, then I shall resign. The committee, he stressed, had to be able to achieve some concrete results if it was to justify its existence. He acknowledged the problems confronted by the international team. Scholars are always under pressure and always take on too much. A deadline is always dead. But he added, if a particular researcher had more texts in his possession than he could effectively handle, he must pass some of them on. The committee would encourage researchers to do precisely this. In passing, Talman also mentioned that, according to rumor, there were still large fragments in the archives, hitherto unknown and yet to be assigned. This rumor was subsequently to prove correct. This is 42 years after they were discovered, and some of them have still not even been assigned. Okay, that kind of gets me angry, but we'll keep going. Bajent asked Professor Talman about the fuss resulting from Eisenman and Davis' requesting to see certain documents. Talman said he was wholly in favor of access being granted them. There was, he stated, a need to help people in utilizing unpublished information. This is a legitimate demand. The scrolls, he concluded, should be made available to all interested and qualified researchers. At the same time, he acknowledged that certain technical difficulties had to be sorted out. These difficulties, which were now being taken in hand, fell under three headings. First, The now out-of-date and superseded catalog needed revision and updating. Second, there was still no full inventory of all the scrolls and scroll fragments, some of which were still unassigned. The only person who knows what is where is Struniel, is what he said. And finally, there was an urgent need for general concordance encompassing all the known text. A general concordance encompassing all the known texts. As for the timetable according to which everything would be published by 1996, Talman was honestly doubtful. Quite apart from whether or not the international team met their deadlines, he queried whether Oxford University Press would be able to produce so many volumes in so short a time. Looking at this schedule, he observed that no fewer than 9 volumes were due to appear between 1990 and 1993. Could Oxford University Press cope with this? And could Struniel handle the editing of so much while still pursuing his own research? If they arose, however, these obstacles would at least be legitimate obstacles, not attributable to obstruction or deliberate withholding of material. They were, in effect, the only obstacles Talman was prepared to tolerate. This was genuinely reassuring. In Talman, the Oversight Committee appeared to have a serious and responsible scholar who understood the problems, was determined to confront them, and would not be deflected by obfuscation. Bagent had learned that the Oversight Committee was scheduled to meet the following day at 10 in the morning. He had, therefore, arranged a meeting for 9 o'clock with Professor Jonas Greenfield, another member of the committee who was on the staff at Hebrew University. He put to Greenfield what had now become a routine question. Would the Oversight Committee have teeth? We would like it to have teeth, Greenfield replied, but they will have to grow. Having nothing to lose, Bagent decided to put the cat among the pigeons. He repeated to Professor Greenfield what Ayala Sussman had said to him, that the committee had been formed primarily to deflect criticism from the Department of Antiquities. Perhaps this would elicit some reaction. It most certainly did. The next morning, Mrs. Sussman telephoned Bagent. Sounding somewhat rattled at first, she stated that she was annoyed with him for telling Professor Greenfield she had made so dismissive a remark. It wasn't true, she protested. She couldn't possibly have said anything like that. Quote, "We are very keen," she stressed, "for this committee to do things." Bagent asked if she wished him to read back to her his notes. When she said yes, he did so. No, Mrs. Sussman insisted. The committee was formed to advise the Department of Antiquities on sensitive matters. As for her dismissive remarks, she had thought she was speaking off the record. Bagent replied that he had originally arranged his interview with Amir Drori, the department's director, in order to obtain precisely for the record a statement of official policy on the matter. Drori had passed him on to Mrs. Sussman, whom he had no reason to suppose was expressing anything other than the official line. The interview, therefore, had been very much on the record. Bagent then became somewhat more conciliatory, explaining the grounds for his concern. The Oversight Committee, he said, was potentially the best thing that happened in the whole sorry saga of the Dead Sea Scroll research. It offered, for the first time, a genuine possibility of breaking the logjam, of transcending academic squabbles, and ensuring the release of texts which should have been made public 40 years ago. It had thus been profoundly disconcerting to hear that this unique opportunity might be squandered, and that the committee might be no more than a bureaucratic mechanism for maintaining the status quo. On the other hand, Bagent concluded he had been reassured by his conversations with Professor Talman and Greenfield, both of whom had expressed an unimpugnably sincere desire for the committee to be both active and effective. Mrs. Sussman now hastened to concur with her colleagues. "We are very keen to get this moving," she affirmed. "We are searching for ways to do it. We want to get the whole project moving as fast as possible." Partly through the determination of Professors Talman and Greenfield, partly through Mrs. Sussman's embarrassment, the Oversight Committee had been galvanized into some sort of resolve. There remained, however, the disquieting question raised by Professor Talman, whether it was technically and mechanically possible for Oxford University Press to produce the stipulated volumes in accordance with Strugnell's timetable. Had the timetable perhaps been drawn up in full knowledge that it couldn't conceivably be met? Might it perhaps have been just another tactic for delaying things while at the same time absolving the international team of any blame? On his return to the UK, Bagent telephoned Strugnell's editor at Oxford University Press. Was a schedule, he asked, feasible? Could 18 volumes of discoveries in the Judean desert be produced between 1989 and 1996? If a blanch could be audible over the telephone, Bagent would have heard one. "The prospect," Strugnell's editor replied, "seems highly unlikely." She reported that she'd just had a meeting with Strugnell. She'd also just had a fax on the matter from the Israeli Department of Antiquities. It was generally accepted, she said, that the dates were very vague. Each date was taken with a pinch of salt. We couldn't cope with more than 2 or 3 a year at the most. Bagent reported that both the Department of Antiquities and the Oversight Committee were worried about whether the timetable could be met. "They are right to be worried about the dates," the editor at Oxford University Press replied. She then expressed what sounded disturbingly like a desire to fob off the entire project. Oxford, she said, felt no need to demand that the series be reserved wholly for themselves. Perhaps some other press, university or otherwise, might be interested in co-publication. She wasn't even sure that Oxford University Press covered its costs on each volume. During the last 4 months of 1990, developments pertaining to the international team and their monopoly began to occur with accelerating momentum. Criticism by scholars denied access to the Qumran material received increasing publicity and currency, and the Israeli government, it seems, was susceptible to the mounting pressure. This pressure was intensified by an article which appeared in November in Scientific American, fiercely castigating the delays and the general situation and according independent scholars space in which to voice their grievances. In mid-November, news broke that the Israeli government had appointed a Dead Sea Scroll scholar, Emmanuel Tov, to act as joint editor-in-chief of the project to translate and publish the entire corpus of the Qumran material. This appointment was apparently made without consulting the existing editor-in-chief, Strugnell, who was reported to have opposed it. By that time, however, Strugnell was ill, in hospital, and not available for comment, or, it would seem, for any serious opposition. By that time, too, even his former colleagues, such as Frank Cross, were beginning to distance themselves from him and to criticize him publicly. There were also other reasons for this sequence of events. Earlier in November, Strugnell, from his quarters at the Ecole Biblique, had given an interview to a journalist for Haaretz, a leading Tel Aviv newspaper. The precise context of his remarks is not at the moment altogether clear, but the remarks themselves, as reported by the world's press, were hardly calculated to endear him to the Israeli authorities and display for a man in his position what can only be described as a flamboyant lack of tact. According to the New York Times of December 12, 1990, Strugnell, a Protestant convert to Catholicism, said of Judaism, quote, "It's a horrible religion. It's a Christian heresy, and we deal with our heretics in different ways." 2 days later, the Times contained more of Strugnell's statement. Quote, I think Judaism is a racist religion, something very primitive. What bothers me about Judaism is the very existence of Jews as a group. According to London's, end quote. According to London's Independent, Struniel also said that the solution, an ominous word, for Judaism was, quote, mass conversion to Christianity. In themselves, of course, these comments had no direct relevance to the question of the Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship, to the withholding of Qumran material from other researchers, and the procrastination in its release. But such comments could hardly have been expected to enhance the credibility of a man responsible for the translation and publication of ancient Judaic texts. Not surprisingly, a major scandal ensued. It was covered by British newspapers. It was a front-page item for newspapers in Israel, France, and the U.S. Struniel's former colleagues, as gracefully but as hastily as possible, endeavored to disown him. By the middle of December, it was announced that he had been dismissed from his post, a decision in which apparently his former colleagues and the Israeli authorities had concurred. Delays in publication and problems of health were cited as factors contributing to his dismissal. Okay, that is the end of part 1. Part 2 is called The Vatican's Representatives, and chapter 6 is called The Onslaught of Science. I'm going to kind of look at over the table of contents over a little bit tonight. Maybe, I'm not sure if we're going to do the entire reading here, or, this is all part of the Reciprocal Church unit. And what we're trying to do is to build our own religious fortress, so to speak, and using various parts to replace the religions that are out of date and kind of too elementary and too discredited to be using anymore. And so this reading is kind of for context for that. So we'll see. I'm not sure about learning about the Vatican, what's going on there, but maybe so. So we'll get it started right here. The Onslaught of Science, chapter 6. Until now, this book has referred to the villains of the piece as the international team. In our conversations with them, however, Robert Eisenman and others would often allude to the École Biblique, the French Dominican archaeological school in Jerusalem. Indeed, the international team and the École Biblique were frequently used interchangeably, and Allegro, too, in his letters would refer to the international team as the École Biblique gang. We wondered why this association should constantly be made. Why were the international team and the École Biblique treated as though they were the same thing? What was the relationship between them? Was it formally defined and delineated? Was the international team officially an adjunct of the École Biblique? Or was the overlap between them so great as to render any distinction superfluous? With some advice and pointers from Eisenman, we endeavored to clarify the matter. As we have noted, the international team from its very beginnings was dominated by Father Devoe, then director of the École Biblique, and by his close friend and disciple, the then Father Malik. As Allegro complained, both men would constantly arrogate first claim to all incoming texts. All fragments are brought first to Devoe or Malik, and complete secrecy is kept over what they are till long after they have been studied by this group. End quote. Even Struniel stated that when fresh material came in, Malik would invariably pounce on it, claiming it fell within the parameters of his own particular assignment. Not surprisingly then, Malik ended up with the lion's share of the most important material, and particularly of the controversial sectarian material. The creation of his monopoly was facilitated by the fact that he was permanently resident in Jerusalem at the time, along with two of his staunchest supporters, DeVoe and Father Jean Starkey. Father Skehan, though not permanently resident in Jerusalem, threw his weight behind this triumvirate. So did Professor Cross, who had been assigned biblical rather than sectarian material anyway. Allegro, of course, cast himself in the role of rebel, but his opposition was hampered by the fact that he was in Jerusalem only intermittently. Of those residing in Jerusalem during the crucial period of excavation, purchase of material, allocation of text, and collation of fragments, only the young John Struniel was not Catholic, and he subsequently converted. All the others were, in fact, Roman Catholic priests attached to and residing at the École Biblique. Among the other current members of the team or writers in the area of Qumran studies working at the École are Father Emile Puech and Father Jerome Murphy O'Connor. It was not just by virtue of being on the spot that this Catholic conclave came to dominate Qumran scholarship. Neither certainly was it by virtue of any outstanding preeminence in the field. Indeed, there was no shortage of less competent or qualified scholars, of no less competent or qualified scholars who, as we have noted, were excluded. A major determining factor was the École Biblique itself, which systematically undertook to establish for itself, as an institution, a position of unrivaled preeminence. The École had its own journal, for example, Revue Biblique, edited by DeVoe, who published in its pages some of the most consequential and influential early articles on Qumran, articles bearing the stamp of first-hand authority. And in 1958, the École launched a second journal, Revue de Qumran, devoted exclusively to the Dead Sea Scrolls and related matters. Thus, the École officially controlled the two most prominent and prestigious forums for discussion of Qumran material. The École's editors could accept or reject articles as they saw fit and were thereby enabled to exert a decisive influence on the entire course of Qumran scholarship. The situation was inaugurated at the very inception of Qumran studies. In addition to its publications, the École created a special research library oriented specifically toward Qumran studies. A card index was compiled which documented every book, every scholarly article, every newspaper or magazine report published on the Dead Sea Scrolls anywhere in the world. All publications on the subject were collected and filed in the library, which was not open to the general public. Although some of the secret, unclassified, and still unassigned scroll material was kept at the École, most of it was housed at the Rockefeller Museum. Nevertheless, the Rockefeller was reduced to the status of a mere workshop. The École became the headquarters, the offices, the school, and the nerve center. Thus, the École contrived to establish itself as the de facto and generally recognized center of all Qumran scholarship, the focus of all legitimate and academically respectable research in the field. The École's stamp of approval could, in effect, underwrite, certify, and guarantee a scholar's reputation. Withholding such endorsement was tantamount to destroying a man's credibility. Officially, of course, the studies over which the École presided were supposed to be non-denominational, non-partisan, impartial, unbiased. The École presented to the world a facade of scientific objectivity. But could such objectivity, in fact, be expected on the part of a Dominican institution with vested Catholic interests to protect? My faith has nothing to fear from my scholarship, DeVoe once stated to Edmund Wilson. No doubt it didn't, but that was never, in fact, the real question. The real question was whether his scholarship and its reliability had anything to fear from his faith. Okay, we are going to stop right there, and we will return tomorrow to figure out what's going on over there at the École Biblique, and how are they going to put off publishing any of the material of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and hopefully we'll get a little bit of a sense of what it was that they were hiding. And so we'll do that tomorrow when we return. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a great day.